As my mind turns to the summer holidays and the increasingly desperate hope that I might one day be able to get out of the vicarage, I've been thinking about how wonderful it would be to sit out for a picnic that you brought with you, or to enjoy fish and chips out of a rumpled piece of newspaper on the seafront. How wonderful it would be to have a picnic on the seashore. That's a lovely image, and you can imagine with me that the day is almost over, and exercise and sea air and that tiredness that comes from relaxation have built up your appetite. And it's so quiet that apart from the sound of the wind and the gulls, there's nothing to disturb you. There is time and space, all the space of the ocean, to help you rest and to help you relax and to help you find your peace. Now, being sensible about the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic on foreign travel, I'm imagining a thoroughly British holiday here for you. Perhaps without some rain, but where at least your hands are huddled for warmth around the chip paper because it's so cold, and you're trying to gorge yourself on the steaming battered fish before the cold wind can cool it down to frozen. Imagine that you're doing this sitting among or on the edge of the sand dunes, perched on one of those dense tufts of marram grass that grows there. As the sun, its light not growing red but somehow fainter and more pale, starts to sink down into the water. This is one association. That sense of being fed and given rest in a pace of peace that we might bring to the Gospel's story of a picnic of fish and bread on the seafront at Galilee. But it's not the only one, or at least it is one that, in its peace, highlights conflict and draws out a second interpretation. That conflict is what, in its peacefulness, and because of its peacefulness, makes painfully obvious the coming confrontation between the peaceful and nourishing presence of Jesus, between the comfort and healing that the crowd experienced by him by a lakeshore in Galilee, and the rest of the world in which he lived. The same kind of world in which, to some degree, all Christians still have an uncomfortable and prophetic calling to live. Jesus' presence throughout the Gospels offers us an image of peacefulness, but it's a peacefulness that wields a sword against the structures of power and against the dark kingdoms of the world. That comes through very clearly in our reading from Matthew's Gospel today, because this picnic of bread and fish is set against the backdrop of the serving up of the head of John the Baptist on a silver platter at a supper at King Herod's palace. You'll probably remember the story that Herod promised a gift to Salome, and she, having been offended by John the Baptist's denunciation of Herod's marriage to her mother, asked for John the Baptist to be killed and his head presented to her. That is the news that Jesus had heard just before this passage. And so the seashore of Galilee is a beautiful and peaceful kind of deserted place. But to Jesus, having just heard the news of the murder of a prophet, of the execution by a king of a man who dared to speak against him, and of his cousin, well, that deserted place might have been a wilderness of grief, or a desert of fear instead. It might have been a desolate and lonely place along his way to the cross, pointing out the consequences of his own confrontation with imperial authority, which runs as a theme throughout Matthew's Gospel. The feeding of 5,000 men and women and children could be seen, therefore, as a picnic that's poised dangerously between the death of John and the danger to Jesus, a kind of macabre feast that marks the way to the Last Supper. Certainly, Jesus' care for the crowd comes from his own heartbrokenness, his willingness to be broken for them. And his healing of their sick has therefore a relationship to his own bereavement. His constant willingness to be poured out, emotionally and physically, into helping others is rooted deep in his willingness to become weak, to become vulnerable, to experience pain for their sake and for ours. It's precisely the humane yet divine root of Jesus' compassion for the crowd that changes one kind of deserted place, the place of fear, to another, the place of peace. Lying in confrontation with the power of Herod's kingship, that kind of peacefulness rescues us too from the power of the world. And it transforms us too, the Christian community that arises from Jesus' group of disciples, to agents of healing and feeding on his behalf. Because when he is moved to compassion, Jesus is moved into action. And he's moved to mobilize other people for action too. He instructs and draws his disciples into the same compassion he feels. He gives thanks, and he breaks bread, and he gets the disciples to draw the crowd into sharing and eating with him that feast of the peaceable kingdom. On one level, and for the early church this was especially true, this story is a kind of commentary on the Eucharists they share. In the Eucharist, we share and we give. We gather and we feed on the sacrament. And, at least in ordinary COVID-free times at least, we do that because Jesus commands it of the church. And whenever we are teetering on the edge of destruction, stuck somewhere between regret and fear, we're able to find in the way that a church community gathers to share that feast that Jesus is made presence in whatever deserted places we find ourselves in. He is there where we most need to be found by him. On another level, and for all the church this is true, this story is a challenge to us. Even in extraordinary times like these, even in times where we have not been able to celebrate the Eucharist together, this element of challenge comes through and comes to have an even deeper meaning for us. For perhaps in acknowledging the power of the challenge of fasting from the Eucharist and yet being called to heal and share in its mission, we are still able to meet with the presence of Christ. This is a challenge to step into, or at least acknowledging that we have stumbled into alongside God, a deserted place, and still hope to be found by God there. This is a challenge to find in God's presence a reflection of our own desire to hunger and thirst after righteousness, and a deepening of it, which must include feeding and watering those who are really hungry and thirsty to be authentic to the Christ who calls us to do so. This is a challenge to help through that hunger and thirst, through being aware of it, through being aware of the fact that God abhors it, to assist in God's creation of a kind of peace that brings a sword against unjust power. so that all are able to be healed. All are fed to fulfillment. All are numbered. And all, even women and children, all count for God and in God's presence. That's the peace that stands against the sort of peace of Herod and the Roman Empire. This is a challenge for you, to give them something to eat, those who lack it, those who feed only on the scraps in places that might seem, unless the transformative power of God is felt there, to be teetering on the edge of destruction.